So I get the question all the time, am I cheating when I use copper? Am I doing a disservice to the ancient knappers that existed 5,000, 10, 20,000 years ago? Why don't you use copper? What's the reasoning? It seems more efficient, it seems way easier, you can get the results you want at the very end much quicker with a whole lot less effort. So with that, here's my take on copper tools in flint knapping. If copper tools actually made flint knapping more precise, then modern flint knappers should be outperforming the ancient ones. But they don't. And that fact forces a conversation that most of us don't want to have. This video is not anti-copper. It is anti-self-deception. But first, when was copper used in flint knapping? For some, that might be a hard pill to swallow, but it is 100% the truth. Copper was used in the aspect of making stone tools. Let's be precise on when that was. Specifically in North America, around the Great Lakes, 4000 to 1000 BCE. And this is known and commonly referred to as the Old Copper Complex. But it's important to note that this copper was raw copper. This wasn't smelted, there wasn't any alloys, it was just raw copper that was found and shaped into different tools. Specifically awls, scrapers, small little knives, and tips that could have been used and were used in pressure flaking. The evidence that many archaeologists have collected around the Great Lakes region shows that copper tools were used in readdressing edges or small retouches, but not the full system that is in place today. There were no giant copper boppers filled with lead. None of that existed. Copper didn't replace stone, it simply just sat alongside it. We go to the Near East and Europe, we have that Chalcolithic period, which is 4500 to 3300 BCE. Copper tools appear in this area after those long-standing flint traditions. Those copper tools in that time were really based on soft material work, poking holes like an awl, scraping. That was kind of the general gist. Now there were some flakers, but the flint knapping skill didn't decline. It didn't change because of this introduction of copper. And elsewhere around the world, specifically Andes, Mesoamerica, Eurasia, slowly these copper tools came into play, but it didn't change anything. It didn't change that stone tool tradition that existed for hundreds and thousands of years. There is no archaeological evidence saying that copper revolutionized those stone tool industries. So simply put, copper never replaced those stone tool systems, even when it was available. Now why this matters, because if copper was the pathway to mastery, ancient systems of flint knapping would have collapsed into it. The stone tool traditions that existed, even with the copper in place in the form of retouchers and little flakers, remained in place until the introduction of iron. That's not ideology, that's just behavior. So yes, copper was used historically in knapping in various regions around the world in very few cases. But it never replaced the stone tool traditions that created the greatest stone tools ever made. And that tells us everything we need to know. Copper didn't replace anything. It sat along beside it until iron came into play. Now copper tools are everywhere in modern flint knapping. Pressure flakers, all sorts of billets, different tools to retouch an edge or throw notches, little copper punches. They're effective, they're consistent, and they produce beautiful results. But the question isn't whether copper works. We know this to be true. The question is whether copper represents the same skill pathway that ancient knappers had to take, or a different one that looks similar on the surface. But these two pathways, an ancient pathway and a modern copper pathway, are not the same thing. Let's take a gander at some stone tools. These stone tools, these artifacts, were not made with copper. Many modern knappers cannot replicate these with copper tools. Some can, but the majority can't. Fluting a Clovis point requires commitment very, very early. There is no recovery phase if something goes wrong. One bad decision or strike and this piece is gone. The Sweetwater biface is the perfect example. Every bit of percussion, every little bit of retouch is done with traditional tools, stone and bone. Even salutary and laurel leaves show a control embedded in the very first flake removed. If copper was not a shortcut, we would clearly see this at the end, and we don't see it. That's not an insult, that is simply evidence. Now here's what copper actually changes in the aspects of flint knapping. Copper allows for deeper and longer pressure flaking. It allows the napper to have a more repeatable engagement with that stone. More importantly, copper allows for a late stage correction. You can have errors in the stone that you can quickly and easily reduce much later in that process of flint knapping that makes that piece look extremely clean. And what it also does, whether we like it or not, it reduces consequences. Platforms that would have totally not survived under an antler billet strike will survive under copper. Errors early on in bifacial thinning are easily fixable with copper tools much later on. Copper controls moves downstream or later on in that flint knapping process. When we think of traditional tools like your stone, your bone, your billets, your antler tine pressure flakers, ancient skills live upstream. Copper skills live downstream. Simply put, from the very beginning with traditional tools, you have to be very precise and consistent with every strike and every hit, every phase of reduction. When you're working with copper, you can have some of those errors early on and have an easier chance of clearing them out downstream. This doesn't make copper useless or wrong, it just makes it different. So here's a statement that makes people uncomfortable. Using copper tools is a shortcut. Copper is a shortcut. Let's just be upfront and honest about that. But it's important to note, not because copper is easier to use, but rather it bypasses the ancient training pathway in flint knapping. Ancient knappers lived within systems where failure mattered immediately. The materials, the access to those materials was limited. Despite people thinking, oh man, they had so much stone back then. Well, they had to walk to go and get it. So it was limited. You failed right up front, you might have to walk a couple more days to go to that great spot where your most ideal stone is. The time and the pressure was real. That's why you see a lot of old ancient points that don't look like modern points. Because if it was good enough to get the job done, if it had clean cutting edges and could puncture a hole, it worked. But it's important to realize that those ancient knappers, any of the consequences they came across at that time were permanent. There was no getting around it. Copper allows modern knappers to arrive at similar forms without having to pass through those same bottlenecks. And that is simply what a shortcut is. The problem isn't using copper. The problem is pretending that the traditional way of flint knapping and the modern way in flint knapping are the same. Essentially, we're judging ancient skills using copper techniques, and then following that up saying anybody can do this with enough practice. That's not humility, that's ego protection. There's nothing wrong, again, with using copper. And why this matters is because skills are just not individual, they're cultural. Some knapping systems will disappear over time. Some abilities will not remain when the constraints that forge them disappear. To put that in a layperson's terms, all the same trials and tribulations and consequences that ancient knappers had to face are quickly disappearing because of the implementation of copper. You're not experiencing that same pathway. You're not experiencing that same tradition to get to the end state of that tool. Copper doesn't resurrect ancient mastery. It lets us stand near it and feel comfortable near it. Using copper today is not wrong, but it is a shortcut. Not to easy results, but to bypassing the training pathway ancient knappers had to endure. If we respect those ancient knappers, we should stop pretending that these pathways are the same. And this isn't gatekeeping. This is simply telling the truth. Use copper. Use copper all you want. Claim it, own it, because the ancient knappers that created those same exact things with stone and bone, that's the respect they should have. I'm not saying that by using copper, you're doing anything different, except that your experience in using copper is a different pathway when you compare it to ancient knappers. I myself have chosen to use stone and bone and billets and all manner of them for many of years. My pathway is different compared to somebody who's used copper boppers, copper pressure flakers, copper pins for notching. It's different pathways. There is a difference. I can identify that difference. You can identify that difference. It's not saying one is better than the other. It's simply saying we might have similar outcomes, but how we journeyed there were extremely different. Ancient people, if they had copper tools, they would have used it. Based on the archaeological record, some did, but it still didn't replace the thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of years of using traditional tools to create the stone tools that ultimately shaped our very existence. Using copper tools takes just as much skill. And I'm not gatekeeping, because gatekeeping says you can't. You can't use copper. I am simply saying that copper tools and traditional tools are not the same thing. Anybody knapping should continue using what keeps them moving forward. Everything I knapp here on this channel, I use stone and bone. That's what I like to use. That's my pathway. For somebody who uses copper, that is their pathway. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. Knappers should understand the usage of copper tools. They should understand that it's different pathways using traditional tools, mixed tools, or just copper tools. Every pathway is different. One isn't right, one isn't wrong. You can pick your poison and just knap tools. That's all I got. This is my take on the old copper conundrum so many people battle with. All right, that's all I got. Remember, tools, not trophies. Appreciate you watching.